I don't even recognize some of these. They seem animalistic, is what I mean.
No, they're worse than animals. They're worse than animals, because animals, they just kill to eat, you know. Human beings, they have a twist in them that makes them far worse than animals when they really get going. Well, I think you really want to know what I think? I think it's revenge against God for the crime of being. That's really what I think. It's Cain and Abel. It's like, oh, Abel's your guy, eh, God? How about if I take him out in the field and beat him to death? How do you feel about that? All my sacrifices went unrewarded. Yeah, it's like, yeah, that's what it is at the bottom of the hell of things. And so, you know, these people, they can light the whole world on fire. And that's partly what so I didn't get your answer to one question, sorry, about the potential warping of your viewpoint because you're so much in the action. Like, how do you know what I mean? If you're in that all the time, that becomes your world in some sense. And how do you know that you're not exaggerating the threat because you're in it all the time?
Because I describes step by step what is happening in, let's say, this particular anecdote of Portland in the summer of 2020. But then I also follow that up with certain data. The consequences, the political consequences, say in Portland last year, the city council did vote to defund law enforcement based on the demands of the radical left activists, those who carried out violence. They defunded police. They also abolished the gun violence reduction team. And a part of my reporting is the crime reporting, particularly in the cities and areas I know best, Pacific Northwest of the United States. And we've seen that we have the actual data of the number of violent crimes that has shot up ever since the death of George Floyd last year in Portland and other major American cities. Portland this year, 2021, has now surpassed its all-time record for homicides. And this is a direct consequence of the political decisions that were made by local politicians in response to their constituents, as well as outsiders going in, carrying out acts of political violence and having certain demands over it.
Okay, so that's what you point to concretely. So let's take that apart a little bit. So you have an ideology at the core of this. I want to go through this really programmatically. One of the things so I'm going to kind of mangle a bunch of questions here together. So these core people, it's not so obvious to me that they're simply left-wing. You know, because, well, some of them are anarchists. Okay, like what the hell's an anarchist exactly? Is he left-wing or right-wing? It's like, in some sense, it doesn't matter. I know ideas matter. That isn't what I'm saying. But in some sense, it doesn't matter because that person who's decided to be violent is working to burn the whole damn thing down for whatever reason. You know, and you also describe them as paramilitary and organized militia. And there's kind of there's a right-wing flavor to that, right? The uniforms, because uniform is more an element of the right than the left, all things considered. And I know that things get hard conceptually when the opposites touch, right? And people debate about whether the National Socialists were left-wing or right-wing. And the answer was, well, they were a complex mixture of both, and the worst of both in some sense, although, you know, maybe not worse than Stalin or Mao. But so that also means that people on the left can point to Antifa, even the violent types, and say, well, you know, what makes you so sure they're left-wing? And why should we bear the mark of their disquiet, you know, as a stain on our political beliefs? So then, okay, now, so there's ambiguity about the real radicals. And it's certainly, to the degree that they're radical, the degree to which they can sow confusion about their political ideologies, all to their benefit, right? So if both the right-wing moderates and the left-wing moderates point to them and say, well, you're left-wing or you're right-wing, depending on what they're trying to justify, and that screws the system up, if they're hardcore anarchists, great, you know, that's all the better. They just play into their hands. Okay, and then you laid out a pathway from that violent interchange to policy decisions like defund the police, for example, and the pulling back of law enforcement. And then you said, well, that's destabilizing cities. That's actually what's happening. That's data. And so, but it's not that easy to trace. It's not so easy to trace that back to the radicals themselves, except insofar as they want to destabilize, right? The ideological trail isn't so clear. So now, is there a question in there? Well, I guess one of the questions is it reasonable to characterize the radical extremists as either left or right? Do you think that's actually helpful?
I characterize them as far left, and I can understand that there may be confusion about the ideology. Certainly, I've very frequently come across people on the right who would describe Antifa as radical Democrats or radical liberals, and that's incorrect. I think what makes me give a partisan label to the Antifa ideology is because by their own admissions and their texts and the philosophers that they look to, it's this fusion of both anarchism as well as communism. So what makes them different from the traditional revolutionary communists of previous decades is that they're not looking for creating a tyrannical top to bottom state communist regime. In fact, they feel that communism failed in part because it was implemented in that way in China or the Soviet Union. They believe in the abolishment of the state, and this is where the anarchist side of the ideology comes out, so that society could be organized into communist communes. And so they've tried some of these experiments many times. Last year, in the middle, at the height of the riots that happened in Seattle, there was the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, otherwise known as Chaz. And I went up there, and that was this experiment that these anarchist communists, Antifa, actually put into practice. They were able to force police to evacuate from a police department and then promptly took over 6 blocks of a neighborhood not that far from downtown, and they established a hard border. And in it, they actually took attempts at state building in terms of this is where you go to get your food, this is where you go to get your water. You don't have to pay for it. This is mutual aid. We're going to do our gardening in the park. They actually try to grow fruits and vegetables.
That's actually pretty funny. That's actually quite funny, the garden in the park thing, because really that's your solution. You dimwits, that's really what you're doing. Now, okay, so let me hammer you on that a bit. So